To the brave youth of Africa, to my fellow leaders, to the heart of our continent, our communities, and to every African living across the world, this message is for you. Africa is not poor. We have been made to believe we are poor. But the truth is, Africa is the richest continent on earth. We have what the world dreams, like gold, diamonds, oil, fertile land, clean water, 12 hours of sunlight every day.
The night Africa stopped asking for permission, Europe felt the tremor before the world did, not from armies or protests, but from a single forbidden seed sprouting in a forgotten field, a seed that defied decades of control. It glowed beneath the moon like a silent rebellion, carrying within it the power to break dependence, rewrite trade empires, and shatter the illusion that the continent must forever kneel to foreign gatekeepers. By dawn, that seed had multiplied across farms, across nations, across generations, and the quiet hum of resistance grew into a roar that echoed across oceans. Europe called it chaos, Africa called it freedom, but the truth was far more dangerous. It was the moment the global balance of power began to tilt. And no one, not even the architects of the old world, could stop what was coming next. The first crack in Europe's illusion of control wasn't loud. It didn't come from a protest, a riot, or a fiery speech on international television. It came from a field quiet, unguarded, forgotten by everyone except the people who had lived and died tending its stubborn soil. In that field, beneath a heat-scorched sky, a seed broke. Open, just one. Just a sliver of green pushing through earth that had been brown and exhausted for decades. But in that sliver, something dangerous lived, something Europe never saw coming. It wasn't the seed itself that ignited the shockwave. It was what it represented. Defiance, a whisper of no more carried through roots and leaves, across borders. And villages, over deserts and forests. Within days, that whisper became the beginning of a revolt that no treaty, no regulation, no diplomatic statement could contain. By the time Europe realized what was happening, the ground beneath global power dynamics had already begun to shift. For years, the continent's agricultural system had existed under rules-crafted oceans. Away rules dressed in soft words like safety, quality, and standards, but rooted in dependence. Imported seeds, imported technology, imported permission. Africa had been allowed to grow, but only within lines drawn by others. Those who controlled the seeds controlled the harvest, and those who controlled the harvest controlled the future. At least, that was how it had always been, until the night the new seeds arrived. They were carried quietly, passed hand to hand under dim lanterns and the pale glow of phone screens. No branding, no foreign logos, no regulatory seals, just small packets wrapped in plain cloth, unassuming, almost humble, yet heavier than any gold ever smuggled across the continent. Their origin was whispered about in back rooms and remote research stations. Some said they were invented by renegade scientists tired of waiting for permission to save their own people. Others believed they came from a forgotten government lab shut down after refusing to follow international guidelines. A few claimed they were ancient seeds resurrected through gene editing, combining ancestral resilience with modern science. The truth didn't matter. Not then. What mattered was that they worked. Within weeks, barren fields transformed into seas of green, crops that once cowered before drought stood tall, leaves wide and defiant. Pests that had crippled harvests for generations now fell harmlessly to the soil. Villagers who had prepared for another season of hunger found themselves harvesting early, filling storage huts that had remained empty for years. Word spread with a speed that frightened even those who believed in the revolt. Farmers called it the miracle harvest. Youth activists called it liberation biology. Europe called it a crisis. Because for the first time in living memory, Africa was producing more than it needed, producing enough to feed itself without permission, producing enough to compete on global markets, producing enough that the old system where the continent was a perpetual consumer, not a competitor, began to crack, and Europe felt the shift like a cold wind blowing from the south. The first warnings came from analysts who studied African trade patterns. Something was wrong with the numbers, they said. Imports were falling, exports were changing. Certain African nations were suddenly refusing contracts that had been unbreakable fixtures of European supply chains for decades. More alarming still, they were forming new regional alliances, fast, deliberate, unapologetic. The second warning came from farmers across Europe, who noticed the uncomfortable truth before the politicians did. Africa's produce was outperforming theirs, cheaper, hardier, more abundant, in some cases, superior in quality. A quiet fear took root: if Africa no longer needed their seeds, their standards, or their approvals, then Europe's agricultural influence, carefully maintained over generations, was evaporating. But it wasn't just agriculture. It was power, leverage, control. The third warning was the most alarming of all. A confidential report delivered to a European Trade Council detailed a discovery that sent ripples of panic through every office it touched. The new African seeds were not traceable. No corporate patents, no genetic signatures. Tied to European companies, no dependency hooks. In other words, Europe couldn't regulate them, couldn't ban them under familiar clauses, couldn't force African markets back into the old pattern. They were free seeds, and free seeds made free nations. Suddenly, the continent that had been treated as a passive receiver of agricultural policy had become an unpredictable innovator, bold, ungoverned, and frighteningly effective. What Europe had suppressed, dismissed, and underestimated for decades was rising with a speed that defied every forecast, every assumption, every model. It didn't help that Africa's youth, connected by social media and disillusioned by inherited dependency, turned the GMO revolt into a cultural uprising. They posted videos of lush fields reclaiming land previously lost to climate change. They created music and artwork celebrating seed sovereignty. They exposed injustices, shared scientific knowledge, and called out the double standards of wealthy nations that used genetic modification freely at home but discouraged it abroad. Why should we starve politely? One viral post read, "Why should we wait for permission to live?" Said another, "From Europe's perspective, it was chaos. From Africa's, it was awakening." Diplomatic pressure followed, threats of sanctions, warnings about long-term environmental risks, offers of negotiations that sounded suspiciously like attempts to restore the old power dynamic. But the continent no longer moved like a collection of fragmented states. It moved like a rising giant, coordinated, confident, and unwilling to bow. Behind closed doors, European officials whispered a phrase none of them wanted to admit aloud: "We're losing control," because the revolt wasn't just about seeds. It was about reclaiming a future that had always been dictated by outsiders. It was about breaking the invisible chains woven through policies, trade agreements, and aid packages. It was about proving that innovation wasn't the exclusive right of the wealthy. And Europe's worst nightmare was now unfolding in real time. Africa was no longer asking for help. Africa was no longer waiting for approval. Africa was becoming a global force. What began as a single, defiant sprout in a forgotten field had grown into a continent-wide wildfire, unstoppable, unapologetic, and destined to change the world. The question was no longer whether Africa could rewrite its destiny. The question was how far Europe would go to stop it. The dust storms over the Sahel drifted like ancient spirits, carrying with them the scent of dry earth and the faint, metallic promise of coming change. Far below, in fields once withered by drought and bureaucratic neglect, young shoots of maize and cowpea glowed with a strange vibrancy, their leaves catching the morning sun with an almost defiant shimmer. These were no ordinary crops. They were the new seeds trial grown in secrecy, nurtured by necessity, protected by a rising tide of continental unity. What began as whispers had become a movement, and what was once a movement was evolving into something far more uncontrollable, a revolt against dependency. Word of the harvest spread like wildfire, carried not by leaflets or speeches but by the testimonies of farmers who once stood on the brink of ruin. They spoke of yields that doubled and tripled, of pests that dared not feast on the reinvented crops, of fields that revived with minimal water. From remote villages in Burkina to coastal towns in Kenya, these stories traveled with a magnetic pull, gathering excitement as if the entire continent had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for anything that belonged solely to them. Yet as hope rose, so did the tension across the Mediterranean in polished conference rooms and paneled offices. The news was received not with curiosity but with dread. For years, Europe had ensured that Africa's agricultural system followed a predictable pattern: seeds controlled, standards dictated, exports filtered. It was a decades-long choreography dressed in the language of sustainability and safety, but beneath the glossy exterior lay the truth: control, and control was now slipping. Reports from ambassadors and trade analysts read like a series of alarms. Not only were African states rejecting long-standing seed regulations, they were forming new alliances, drafting new laws, and worst of all, experimenting independently with biotechnology. Independence in itself was unsettling. Success was catastrophic. In one corridor, a cluster of policymakers debated in hushed voices, the conversation riddled with anxiety. If African nations could produce higher yields with fewer restrictions, if they could innovate without Europe's frameworks, if they could free themselves from agricultural imports and dependency, then Europe's leverage, its bargaining power, its carefully constructed influence would evaporate. The fear was not about food, it was about power, but far from those air-conditioned chambers, the heart of the revolt was beating fast. In a modest research center in East Africa, once underfunded, ignored, and dismissed scientists worked around the clock. Their lab smelled of ethanol, old books, and an undercurrent of exhilaration. They analyzed soil samples, tested gene edits, crossbred strains resilient to climate extremes. They did not seek praise or politics. They sought survival. And as the first results materialized, a quiet pride settled into their bones, the kind of pride that grows after generations of being told what cannot be done. Outside the lab, crowds gathered, farmers arrived with sacks of grain for testing. Journalists hovered at the gates, capturing images of a movement still trying to define itself. Youth volunteers organized workshops in rural communities, teaching people how to plant the new seeds and protect them from sabotage. They moved with urgency, aware that their efforts were being watched, challenged, and sometimes undermined. Amid this growing momentum, a convoy rumbled down a red earth road toward a town square where thousands waited under the blazing afternoon sun. When the lead vehicle stopped, a figure emerged carrying a single crate of seeds, small, unassuming, and yet symbolizing the very rebellion that now threatened to redraw the global map. The crowd surged forward, a wave of hands reaching not to the figure but to the crate, desperate to touch the future they had been denied for too long. The message was clear: no more hand-me-down solutions, no more foreign gatekeepers, no more condescension disguised as charity. Africa was reclaiming its agricultural destiny, seed by seed, but revolutions, even peaceful ones, rarely go unchallenged. Late one evening, the research center received an encrypted message: data files corrupted, servers breached, years of findings stolen. Panic rippled through the team. They had expected resistance, but not this level of intrusion. Somewhere across the sea, a team of analysts was already reviewing the stolen data, seeking weaknesses, loopholes, anything that could be used to discredit the movement. Yet the attackers underestimated one thing: resilience born from necessity. Backup drives emerged from safes hidden beneath floor tiles. Handwritten notes were retrieved from wooden drawers. What was stolen digitally could never erase the knowledge held in the minds of the scientists or the seeds already planted in thousands of fields. If anything, the attack only strengthened the movement. Overnight, support doubled. Leaders who once hesitated now spoke boldly. For every attempt to suppress the revolt, the continent responded with sharper unity. Meanwhile, in bustling markets from Lagos to Addis, the economic undercurrent was shifting. Traders noticed the price of imported grain dropping as demand weakened. Local produce flourished, food insecurity indices improved. Street vendors set up stalls selling dishes made from the new crops, marketing them as freedom harvests. Yet across the Mediterranean, frustration deepened. In one particularly tense meeting, policymakers debated sanctions, funding cuts, and stricter export regulations. But these measures felt like relics of an earlier era. Africa was no longer waiting for permission, and Europe was no longer the gate through which all decisions flowed. The old balance of power, silent, assumed, unquestioned, was shifting beneath their feet. And then came the watershed moment. A coalition of African states announced a continent-wide agricultural alliance designed to share biotechnology, harmonize seed laws, and invest jointly in research infrastructure. The declaration reverberated globally. Economists called it unprecedented, analysts called it destabilizing, Europe called it concerning, but the people it mattered to the most, the farmers, the scientists, the youth, called it liberation. One farmer, leaning against his hoe at sunset, spoke to a journalist through a broad smile. "We're not fighting anyone," he said. "We're feeding ourselves." The statement traveled far, carried by social media hashtags, quoted in speeches, displayed on banners. It was simple yet powerful, a reminder that this revolt was not born from hostility but from necessity. Still, storms gathered on the horizon. Europe launched a public campaign raising alarms about unknown risks, unregulated experiments, potential ecological disasters. They framed the revolt as reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. Experts appeared on television warning of catastrophic consequences, but many Africans viewed the campaign with suspicion, even anger. After decades of losing crops to drought, pests, and poorly fitting foreign standards, the warnings felt hollow. In one university hall in West Africa, students gathered for a debate. The energy in the room crackled. On one side were young intellectuals arguing for sovereignty, innovation, and the right to choose their own path. On the other were those concerned that rushing too fast might lead to unknown repercussions. The debate was fiery yet respectful, illustrating a continent willing to question itself, analyze its direction, and learn from its own experiences rather than imported doctrines. Outside the hall, the campus buzzed with life. Murals depicting thriving fields and futuristic labs covered the walls. Startup incubators offered grants to develop new agricultural technologies. Drones hovered above research farms collecting data. It was as if the continent was stepping into a future that had long been delayed, suppressed, or redirected. The revolt extended beyond agriculture. It awakened conversations about economic independence, technological sovereignty, and cultural pride. Musicians sang of seed freedom. Painters captured the energy of the movement in bold strokes. Writers chronicled the rise of a new Africa, imperfect, determined, and unbound. Still, Europe was not ready to concede. A high-level delegation traveled across several African capitals offering revised trade deals, improved funding, and collaborative frameworks. Their tone was diplomatic, but the subtext was unmistakable: return to the old order, or risk being isolated. But the reception was lukewarm at best. Leaders were polite but firm. The era of dependency was over. One evening, in a dimly lit in North Africa, two scholars discussed the shift over cups of steaming mint tea. One argued that Europe's fear stemmed from losing influence over a continent long seen as an extension of its economic strategy. The other insisted that the revolt was not anti-European but pro-African, something many outsiders failed to grasp. As they spoke, a group of young activists sat a nearby table listened in silence, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones as they organized the next Continental Symposium on Food Sovereignty. Weeks later, the symposium took place in a massive hall overlooking the savannah. Farmers, scientists, students, and leaders sat together, not separated by status or rank but united by purpose. The air was thick with anticipation. Speaker after speaker took the stage, sharing stories of struggle, triumph, experimentation, and discovery. It was not a gathering of experts lecturing the masses. It was a collective shaping its own destiny. Outside the hall, vendors sold local dishes made from the revolutionary crops, and the aroma filled the air with a celebratory warmth. Children ran between the tents with playful exhilaration, unaware that the moment they lived through would be chronicled for generations. As night fell, dancers took to the stage, drummers pounding rhythms that echoed across the landscape. The performance was a celebration of heritage, resilience, and renewal, a reminder that revolutions are not only fought in labs and farms but in the beating heart of culture. Yet even in the joyous moment, vigilance remained. Despite the movement's progress, challenges persisted. Ecosystems needed careful monitoring. Regulations had to be crafted with precision. Knowledge had to spread to even the most remote communities. The revolt was powerful, but it was still young, fragile in places, vulnerable to sabotage, misinformation, and internal disagreements. The people knew the path forward would not be without hurdles, but unlike before, the decisions would be theirs. Across the sea, Europe watched with unease as Africa stepped further from its shadow. Commentaries on late-night television shows grew sharper, labeling the revolt a geopolitical nightmare, a strategic disaster, a loss of leverage. Analysts speculated about future trade battles, supply chain disruptions, and the decline of Europe's role in global agriculture. But the more they protested, the more Africa advanced. Eventually, the panic crystallized into a single realization: Africa had stopped asking for permission. In one final symbolic moment, a group of African scientists gathered on a hill as dawn approached. They carried no flags, made no speeches, and declared no victory. Instead, they planted a handful of seeds into the soil quietly. Intentionally, reverently. The act was simple, almost unremarkable, yet it represented everything the revolt stood for: autonomy, courage, and the belief that a new world could grow from the ground up. As the sun rose, casting golden light over the fields, the seeds lay buried beneath the earth, waiting to sprout. Europe, restless and uneasy, braced for what would come next. Africa, hopeful and resolute, moved forward with a boldness that could no longer be contained. And in the hush of early morning, the wind carried a whisper across the continent, a whisper of a future reclaimed, of power redefined, and of a revolt that had grown beyond seeds into something far more formidable. A new chapter in the world's story, written by Africa's own hands.